women's rights that lead up to the women's liberation movement, and we've come now full cycle towards the Mgtow movement. So in order to try and get some sort of understanding of how this all came about, we really have to go back in time. Into the vacuum that was created by the retreating Roman Empire, which moved its capital from Rome to Byzantium, you had the invasion of these barbarian tribes in Europe, which had been partially Romanized, and a lot of their beliefs and religious practices were adopted from the Romans, and others were just completely pagan. Now, there arose kings who wanted to enlarge their empires and seek control over Europe, and they did this in a specific kind of a way. And that way was to ally themselves with the central system of thought and belief, which was the Roman Church. They adopted them simply because the Roman Church had access to knowledge and literature, and there was a civilizing factor which attracted the kings who wanted education, wanted to learn to read and write, and wanted to be like the Eastern Empire. And because of this, the popes wanted to exchange that for protection. They needed the military power of kings. So the Great Agreement. Now the Pope and Charlemagne shared a common ambition. And that ambition was to restore the West to its former glory as part of the Roman Empire. The Pope had actually summoned Charlemagne to Rome to actually assist him as a military necessity for keeping the barbarians out of Rome, and it was vital for the Pope to have an ally with a military army that he could call upon. So while Charlemagne was in Rome, he had actually previously visited Ravenna, and he saw the magnificence of the Byzantine style building there, and he thought to himself, I am going to build a very similar type of empire, which he did try to do in Aachen, which was his capital. But in Rome, he was having mass with the Pope, and the Pope apparently suddenly put a crown on his head, much to his modest surprise. But all indications would say that he knew very well what was going to happen, and he was then proclaimed by the Romans as the new Roman emperor, and out of that he now had control over the entire western part of Europe, and the Pope had his military arm. So they both got a great big push forward towards their ambition. What was basically known as the Carolingian Renaissance. A British scholar, Alcuin of York, came to Aachen and became Charlemagne's private tutor, you could say. Their chapel, the Aachen's Palatine Chapel, was definitely modeled on Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and other government buildings were basically copies of Roman buildings. So it's from this point on that the looking backwards towards Rome became an obsession with this new Christianized Europe. But it was a political Christianity. So you had the religious organizations and the aristocracy, which were more or less on the same footing of power, and very often they would vie for power, and there would be strong confrontations throughout this time between the church and the ruling kings of Europe. The feudal system was a social order, and it was similar to a contract in which individuals pledged loyalty and services to somebody of higher rank. So the loyalty was rewarded with a promise of protection. In medieval Europe, the monarch was at the top of the feudal system, and he was the king. he would grant land called fiefs to tenants, who were usually the lords. Before they could be granted, that person had to take part in a ceremony of swearing before the king, in which they were made a vassal. This involved him swearing his loyalty to the king and agreeing to fight for him should there come a war. These tenants-in-chief were required to pay the king, and those who were well educated, members of the church, had to give him advice, and they could be scholars who taught him. And the most important task of the nobles was to provide the king with soldiers to fight into his army, which enabled the king to retain even more wealth and power, since he had a large army that he could call upon. So the lords granted land to other tenants beneath them, which usually included knights. In exchange for that, it was the responsibility of the knight to fight for the king and to protect his property as well. He was also required to give the lord part of the taxes that he received from the bottom of the rung, which were the peasants, and they were by far the majority of people, and they had very few rights. Subtenants often granted land to peasants at times, who were also known then as serfs. In return for renting the land to the peasantry, payment was made in some form of work or goods. The basic system of feudalism was built on the understanding that each person in society knew their specific place. The support of the powerful and influential organization of the church assisted the kings to maintain order. That was the agreement. So in gratitude to the church and in order to gain favor, monarchs would often give land to the clergy. Land was donated to the church by wealthy nobles. At the height of its power, the church became the largest landowner in Europe. The idea of chivalric behavior does have its roots in this time, where men treated women with special deference, and the idea that women were put on some kind of a pedestal was really part of a literary convention that was adopted at the time, and it was just as much a story then as it is now. Romantic chivalry might have existed, but it was quite a small part of society, maybe the 5% of the nobility at the top of the echelons. So it describes women in a highly laudatory way. Contradictory attitudes about women did exist. Although they were put on a pedestal, they were also treated almost solely as sexual objects. The church likened women to Eve and to Mary, two opposing personalities. Like Eve, women were seen as sinful and responsible for the problems of males and of society, but like Mary, they were symbols of purity and virtue. Socially and spiritually, they were on a higher, or at least a different plane from men, and they were viewed as unapproachable by the carnal male. Love of her ennobled man's existence. So this concept is basically rooted in the idea that the barbarism of men and the violence of their natures depends on women to complete them, to make them into civilized human beings, to make them into gentlemen. Men need a woman to bring out their qualities of love and caring and gentleness and respect and gentleman manners and courtly elegance. All of those things are the woman's domain, which without women around, men are devoid of. And the idea of the perfect woman, or this courtly love, was to reverence that aspect, that ability of woman. It's a quality, and it's been elevated to ridiculous levels with Mary worship and this idea of sacred courtly love. But we saw it repeated throughout history again and again. It's a very mysterious quality that is very attractive in the minds of writers and of artists. And one key description of this comes out in a movie that came out in the 90s, where Billy Crystal and Jack Palance act in a film called City Slickers, in which they find themselves out in the wilderness, far away from the city, which has reduced men to these weak characters. And Jack Palance is this rugged individual who Billy Crystal just, wants to be like, but doesn't really have what it takes. And Jack Palance tells him about this exact idea of a time when he saw a woman, he observed her for a while, and she didn't do anything overtly sexual or anything. It was just her pose, what she did, that for him was just a perfect moment. And Billy Crystal says to him, but why didn't you pursue her? You could have got into a relationship, it could have been a wonderful thing. And Jack Palance says to him, you don't understand. It would have ruined it. And that's the exact concept, is an ideal and a thought in his mind is far better than the real thing. And this is the rationale behind that is, if he met this woman and spoke to her and got to know her, she might have been, had all kinds of problems and issues. They might have never gotten along. They could have ended up, having a terrible relationship and breaking up, that kind of thing. But at that moment, he saw something that was something he yearned for, longed for, aspired to, in a kind of a state of reverence, something that could exist, something that would exist in an ideal world that doesn't really exist, but it was just for a moment he experienced it, and he held on to the memory as something special. That encapsulates the idea of the chivalric romance in modern times. So what Curly's telling us in City Slickers is that ideal love is a spiritual idea. It's something that you can imagine, that you can conceive of, but you can never have it. Just like Lancelot can never have Guinevere, we will never find the true love. And this is the human condition.